The city never truly slept. Its streets buzzed with life even in the dark hours, neon signs casting flickering lights on cracked sidewalks. Sarah loved her city. She had grown up here, a quiet girl in a noisy world. At 20, her life was just beginning to bloom. She lived alone in a small apartment on the 5th floor of a building that creaked with age. It wasn't much, but it was hers, a little haven where she could dream about the life she wanted. That evening, the air was heavy with the scent of rain. Sarah stood by her window, looking out at the glowing city below. She had just finished her favorite routine: hot tea, a good book, and the soft hum of the city as her soundtrack. But something felt off tonight, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. She shook the feeling off. Around midnight, Sarah locked her door and climbed into bed. She barely closed her eyes when she heard it, a faint scratching sound. Her heart skipped. It came from the hallway outside her apartment. Probably the neighbor's cat, she muttered to herself, pulling the blanket tighter. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like someone trying to get in. Sarah froze, every muscle tense. The door creaked as if under pressure. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and dialed the police. Before she could hit call, the door burst open with a deafening crash. 3 figures stormed into her apartment, faces masked and movements swift. Sarah screamed, but one of them clamped a gloved hand over her mouth. She kicked and struggled, but they were too strong. "Quiet," one of them hissed, a voice deep and cold. The room spun as they threw a sack over her head. Darkness consumed her. Sarah's breaths came fast and shallow. She couldn't see, couldn't scream. All she heard were her muffled sobs and the heavy footsteps of her captors as they dragged her away. They shoved her into a van, the metallic clang of the door slamming shut echoing in her ears. Sarah sat trembling, her wrists bound. The van rattled as it sped through the city streets, her mind racing. "Why me?" she thought. "Who are they? What do they want?" The drive felt endless. Every second stretched into a lifetime. Sarah clung to faint hope. Someone would realize she was gone, the police would find her. This was all just a horrible mistake. But deep down, she knew this wasn't random. They had come for her. The van screeched to a halt. The doors flung open, and rough hands yanked her out. The sack was ripped off her head, and Sarah blinked at the blinding light of a single bulb hanging overhead. They had brought her to a basement. The air was damp and suffocating, the walls lined with crumbling bricks. She could see nothing but shadows beyond the circle of light. "Sit," commanded the deep-voiced man. Sarah hesitated, her legs trembling. A sharp push sent her collapsing onto a hard wooden chair. The leader, tall and imposing, leaned close. Though his face was hidden, Sarah felt his eyes pierce her. "You're here because you were chosen," he said, his voice like ice. "For what?" Sarah stammered, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to one of the others, who produced a set of heavy chains. Sarah's heart sank as they bound her wrists and ankles to the chair. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Let me go." The man tilted his head, as if amused by her plea. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving her alone with the sound of dripping water and her own sobs. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time lost all meaning in the cold, oppressive silence. Sarah's mind raced with questions, fears, and desperate prayers. Who were they? What did they want? The basement was her entire world now. The chains bit into her skin, a cruel reminder of her helplessness. But Sarah was not the kind to give up. Deep inside, a spark of defiance began to flicker. "I will survive," she thought. "No matter what, I will find a way out." But as the shadows around her seemed to grow darker, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was just beginning. Sarah awoke to darkness, her body aching from the cold, hard floor. Her chains rattled with every movement, a cruel symphony reminding her of her captivity. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of her blood where the shackles had rubbed her raw. Her stomach growled, the sharp pang of hunger gnawing at her insides. How long had it been since she was taken? Hours. Days. The basement had no windows, no clocks. Time was a cruel trick, stretching endlessly in this suffocating dungeon. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Then came the footsteps. Sarah's body tensed as the sound grew louder. She gripped her chains, pulling herself into a sitting position. A sliver of light cut through the darkness as the door opened. The tall man, the leader, stepped inside. His figure backlit like a shadow come to life. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low and icy. "What do you want from me?" Sarah's voice trembled but carried a spark of defiance. The man chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. He crouched before her, his masked face inches from hers. "You'll find out," he said simply. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plate with a single slice of bread. He placed it on the ground just out of her reach. "Eat," he ordered. Sarah's stomach clenched at the sight of food, but she refused to move. The man tilted his head, waiting for her to give in. "I don't need your help," she spat, though her voice wavered. He straightened, his figure looming over her. "Suit yourself." Without another word, he turned and left, slamming the door shut. The hunger eventually won. Sarah crawled toward the bread, her chains scraping against the floor. She hated herself for giving in, but she knew she needed her strength if she was ever going to escape. As the days passed, a grim routine took shape. The captors, there were 3 of them, took turns checking on her. The leader was the most frequent visitor, his calm demeanor masking a cold ruthlessness. The others were less composed, their nervous energy betraying cracks in their resolve. Sarah made note of everything, their movements, their patterns, their weaknesses. One day, the smaller of the captors came alone. He fumbled with the chains, his hands shaking as he tightened her restraints. "You're scared," Sarah whispered, her voice sharp like a knife. "Shut up," he snapped, but his voice wavered. Sarah held his gaze, her defiance unbroken. "You don't want to be here. You're just following orders." The man flinched but said nothing. He finished his task and hurried out, slamming the door behind him. Sarah smiled faintly. She had found a crack in their armor. Each visit from the captors revealed more about them. The tall leader was methodical, the small one skittish, and the third, a stocky brute, was prone to outbursts of anger. Sarah began to piece together their dynamic, realizing that the leader's control over the others wasn't absolute. Despite her growing awareness, the days in the dungeon wore on her. The cold seeped into her bones, and the silence pressed heavily on her mind. She began to hear whispers in the dark, fragments of conversations she couldn't place. Her memories of the outside world became hazy, like dreams slipping away. But Sarah clung to hope. One day, the leader returned with something different, a notebook and a pen. He placed them in front of her. "Write," he commanded. Sarah looked up at him, confused. "Write what?" "Everything. Your life, your thoughts. Who you were before." She hesitated, her mind racing. Was this another one of his twisted games? Or was there an opportunity here? Slowly, she picked up the pen and began to write. At first, her hand trembled, the words coming out jagged and uneven. But as she wrote, something shifted. Memories flooded back, her parents, her friends, her dreams of becoming a teacher. Each word was a lifeline, anchoring her to the person she had been before. The leader watched silently, his expression unreadable behind the mask. When she finished a page, he took it, folding it carefully before slipping it into his coat. "Good," he said, standing to leave. "What are you doing with them?" Sarah demanded. He paused, turning back to her. "You'll find out." That night, Sarah lay awake, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The notebook was a small victory, a connection to the outside world, however twisted. It gave her hope that her words, her story, might reach someone who could save her. Sarah's days became a careful dance between submission and rebellion. Every action, every word, every look was deliberate. She knew she couldn't overpower her captors physically, so she waged a silent war, a battle of wits and patience. She noticed cracks in their unity. The stocky one, she named him Brute in her mind, argued often with the smaller jittery man Mouse. Their voices echoed through the walls when they thought she couldn't hear. The leader, calm and calculating, always intervened, his authority holding them together like brittle glue. Sarah listened carefully. The more she learned about their weaknesses, the more hope grew in her chest. One day, Mouse entered alone, carrying the usual plate of stale bread and water. His eyes darted nervously around the room as he set the food down. "Why are you helping him?" Sarah asked softly. Mouse flinched but didn't respond. "You're scared of him, aren't you?" she pressed. "Shut up," he muttered, backing toward the door. Sarah leaned forward, her chains clinking softly. "You don't have to do this. You can walk away. Help me, and I won't tell anyone you were part of this." Mouse hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. For a brief moment, Sarah saw the conflict in his eyes. Then the door slammed shut, and she was alone again. But she had planted a seed. The next few days were tense. The leader, whom she now called Shadow, seemed to sense a shift in the air. His visits became more frequent, his gaze lingering on her longer than before. "You've been busy," he said one evening, holding up her notebook. Sarah met his gaze, defiance flickering in her eyes. "I'm doing what you asked." Shadow's lips curled into a faint smirk. "You're clever, Sarah. But don't forget your place." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "If you think you can outsmart me, you'll regret it." For the first time, Sarah felt true fear. Shadow's calm demeanor masked a darkness she couldn't fully comprehend. Despite Shadow's warnings, Sarah didn't stop. She continued to write, each page a mix of truth and carefully planted lies. She wrote about things she overheard, about clues that might lead someone to her location if the notebook ever left the dungeon. She wrote about cracks in the walls, faint echoes of traffic, and the patterns of her captors' movements. Her words became weapons, and her mind sharpened with every stroke of the pen. One night, Brute came in, his face twisted with rage. He threw her plate of food across the room, sending it clattering against the wall. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he growled, looming over her. Sarah stayed silent, her heart pounding. "Shadow thinks you're special," Brute sneered. "But I see right through you." He grabbed her by the collar, yanking her to her feet. "Maybe I should show you what happens when you play games." Sarah bit back a scream, her mind racing. She had to stay calm, had to think. "Let her go." Mouse's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Brute froze, his grip tightening for a moment before he released her. Sarah stumbled back, her chains clinking as she fell to the floor. "What are you doing here?" Brute barked. "Shadow sent me," Mouse lied, his voice steadier than Sarah expected. "He said to leave her alone." Brute glared at him, his fists clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he might ignore Mouse altogether. But then he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Mouse lingered, his hands trembling as he knelt beside Sarah. "Are you okay?" he whispered. Sarah nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "I can't do this anymore," Mouse muttered, his eyes darting toward the door. "But if I help you, you'll be free," Sarah whispered, gripping his arm. "We both will." Mouse hesitated, then nodded. "Tomorrow. I'll leave the door unlocked." The next day passed in agonizing silence. Sarah's heart raced every time she heard footsteps, every time the door creaked open. But Shadow didn't come. Neither did Brute. Only Mouse entered, and he didn't say a word. That night, as the basement plunged into darkness, Sarah waited. She counted the seconds, her ears straining for any sound. Finally she heard it, the faint click of the lock. Mouse's voice was barely audible. "Oh now. Hurry." Sarah didn't hesitate. She slipped through the door, her chains left behind, and stepped into the cold, musty hallway. For the first time in years, she was free of her restraints. But freedom came with a price. The dungeon was a labyrinth, its corridors twisting and turning in endless confusion. Every shadow felt alive, every creak of the floor a threat. Sarah's heart pounded as she crept through the darkness. She had no map, no sense of direction. All she had was the faint glimmer of hope guiding her forward. But the quiet war wasn't over yet. And in the shadows, her captors were stirring. Sarah's bare feet padded softly on the cold concrete floor. Her breath shallow and rapid as she slipped through the labyrinth of corridors. The dim light from a flickering bulb overhead was the only guide she had, casting eerie shadows that made every corner feel alive. Mouse had risked everything to unlock the door for her, but she knew the others would realize her absence soon. She had to move quickly. Her ears strained for any sound, the thud of boots, the scrape of a door opening, or even a muffled shout. Nothing. The silence was oppressive, but she pressed on, clinging to the faint hope that somewhere ahead lay freedom. The corridor ended at a heavy steel door. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the handle. It was locked. She cursed under her breath, her mind racing. Think, Sarah. Think. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help. There to her right, a rusty pipe sticking out from the wall. It was loose, its base corroded. She tugged at it with all her strength, her muscles screaming in protest. Finally, it gave way with a metallic groan. Using the pipe as a lever, she jammed it into the lock and twisted. The lock resisted at first but then gave way with a loud snap. The door creaked open, revealing another dark hallway. She wanted to cry in frustration, but there was no time. She stepped through, the weight of the pipe comforting in her hands. Sarah hadn't gone far when she heard it, a distant shout. Her heart sank. They knew she was gone. Footsteps echoed behind her, growing louder. She broke into a run, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway twisted and turned, each corner a gamble. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stop. Find her. Shadow's voice roared, cold and furious. Sarah pushed herself harder, her body screaming in protest. The sound of pursuit grew closer. She rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. Ahead of her was another steel door, but this one had a small window. Through it she could see faint light, moonlight. It was the outside world. Freedom was just on the other side. The door was locked, of course. Sarah cursed again, her hands shaking as she searched for another way. The lock was more robust than the last one. Her rusty pipe wouldn't work here. Desperation clawed at her. She slammed her fist against the door, tears streaming down her face. Oh, not now. Footsteps thundered closer. She had seconds, maybe less. Her eyes darted around. To her left was an old electrical panel, its cover slightly ajar. Without thinking, she jammed the pipe into the wires, sparks flying as she wrenched it free. The panel buzzed angrily, and suddenly the door clicked open. She didn't hesitate. She flung it open and stumbled outside, the cool night air hitting her like a wave. The world was a blur of sensations, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, the glow of a full moon overhead. Sarah ran, her legs burning, her lungs on fire. Behind her, the shouts of her captors grew louder. There she is, Brute bellowed. Sarah ducked into the shadows of the trees lining the property. She crouched low, her chest heaving as she tried to stay silent. The captors were close now. She could hear their voices, their boots crunching on the gravel. She won't get far, Shadow said. His voice calm but filled with menace. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't outrun them. Not like this. She needed a distraction. Her hand brushed against a rock on the ground. She picked it up and hurled it into the distance. The sound of it crashing through the underbrush made Brute and Mouse spin around. There! Brute shouted, running toward the noise. Shadow didn't move. He stood still, scanning the darkness. Sarah held her breath, willing herself to become invisible. After what felt like an eternity, Shadow turned and followed the others. Sarah waited until she was sure they were gone, then crept out of her hiding spot. The forest thinned as she moved forward, and soon she saw it, the lights of the city in the distance. Tears of relief streamed down her face. She was almost there. But as she stepped onto the edge of a dirt road, a car's headlights blinded her. She froze, her heart pounding. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, rolled down his window. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Sarah hesitated, her body trembling. "Help me," she whispered. The man nodded, opening the passenger door. "Get in." As the car sped away, Sarah collapsed into the seat, her body and mind finally surrendering to exhaustion. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt the faint glimmer of hope. The car rumbled along the empty road, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, clutching her trembling hands together. She could feel the man's concerned gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. "What happened to you?" he asked softly. Sarah shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, just take me somewhere safe." The man nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "We'll get you to the police station. You're safe now." The word safe felt foreign to Sarah, like a distant memory she couldn't quite grasp. The world outside the dungeon was overwhelming. The rush of air through the window, the hum of the engine, the faint scent of the man's cologne. It was freedom, but it didn't feel real. At the station, Sarah found herself surrounded by warmth and light, things she hadn't known for years. A kind police officer wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and handed her a cup of tea. She clung to it, the warmth grounding her in a world that felt too bright, too loud. "Can you tell us your name?" another officer asked, his voice gentle. "Sarah," she whispered. "What happened to you, Sarah?" Her mind reeled. How could she explain the nightmare she had endured? The words stuck in her throat. "I was taken," she finally managed, her voice cracking. 5 years ago. They kept me in a basement." The room fell silent. The officers exchanged looks of shock and pity. "You're safe now," the kind officer said, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "We'll find the people who did this to you." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Shadow's cold, calculating voice echoed in her mind. "You'll regret it." Sarah didn't sleep that first night after her escape. The rhythmic hum of the hospital machines was a far cry from the suffocating silence of her cell, but her mind couldn't rest. Every creak of the door or murmur in the hallway sent her heart pounding. She sat in the hospital bed, clutching the thin blanket around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the window. The city lights sparkled in the distance, a world she hadn't seen in years. She was free, but the weight of those years pressed heavily on her chest. The days that followed were a blur of interviews, hospital visits, and awkward reunions. The morning sun broke through the clouds, painting the room in soft gold. A nurse entered, her face kind but cautious. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you," she said gently. Sarah tensed. Her parents. She wasn't sure if she was ready. She had thought about this moment for so long, imagined running into their arms and crying tears of joy. But now, the idea of facing them filled her with dread. What would she say? What could she possibly say to make up for the years she had been gone? Before she could respond, the door creaked open. A woman and a man stepped inside. Sarah's breath hitched. Her mother's hair was streaked with gray, her father's shoulders more stooped than she remembered. Time had changed them too. "Sarah," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Mom." They rushed to her side, enveloping her in their arms. The hug was warm and familiar, yet it felt foreign, like trying to fit a piece into a puzzle she no longer belonged to. The reunion was bittersweet. Her parents, who had never given up hope, held her tightly as if they'd never let go. But Sarah felt like a stranger in her own life. Her childhood home, once a place of comfort, now felt suffocating. She couldn't sleep in her old bed. The softness of the mattress was too foreign. But it only reminded her of how much she had lost. She couldn't bring herself to sleep there, opting instead for the couch, where she could see the front door. She flinched at shadows that weren't there. The sound of a neighbor's dog barking sent her into a panic. Her mother tried to comfort her, but Sarah pulled away. I can't just go back to normal, Sarah said one night, her voice trembling. Her mother's face crumpled. We'll figure this out together, sweetheart. I promise. The world outside had moved on without her. Friends she once knew had grown up, moved away, started new lives. The media frenzy didn't help. Reporters camped outside her family's house, their cameras flashing whenever the door opened. The headlines screamed her story, the girl who escaped. 5 years in darkness. Can't we make them go away? Sarah pleaded, covering her ears to block out the questions shouted from the lawn. Her father sighed. They'll lose interest eventually. Just try to ignore them. But ignoring them was impossible. Sarah felt like a specimen under a microscope. Her every move scrutinized. She hated it. The captivity she had fled had been replaced by a different kind of prison. The trial loomed over her like a storm cloud. The police had caught her captors, Shadow, Brute, and Mouse, after a raid on the property. Her testimony was the key to putting them away, but the thought of facing them again made her stomach churn. You don't have to do this alone, said Detective Harris, the officer assigned to her case. His steady presence had been one of the few things anchoring her in the chaos. We'll be with you every step of the way. Still, Sarah hesitated. What if they try something? What if they look at me and know I'm still scared of them? Harris leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. You're stronger than they are, Sarah. You proved that the night you escaped. The day of the trial arrived, and Sarah's anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. As she sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, she felt the weight of her captor's presence. Shadow sat with the same cold composure she remembered, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Brute glared at her with open hatred, while Mouse avoided her gaze altogether, his head bowed. When it was her turn to testify, Sarah's legs felt like jelly as she walked to the stand. She took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the witness box for support. My name is Sarah Jacobs, she began, her voice trembling. I was taken 5 years ago, and they held me captive in a basement. The words spilled out, each one like a blade cutting through her soul. She described the darkness, the fear, the moments of hope and despair. Her voice faltered when she recounted the punishments, the failed escape, and the psychological torment. Shadow's gaze was unwavering, but for the first time, Sarah felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just telling her story, she was reclaiming it. Life after the trial was a maze of therapy sessions and small victories. Sarah struggled with nightmares, flinching at shadows that weren't there. But she refused to let the darkness consume her. One day, she returned to her notebook, the same one Shadow had made her write in. She began filling its empty pages, not with fear, but with hope. She wrote about her dreams of becoming a teacher, her desire to help others who had suffered like she had. She volunteered at a shelter for survivors of trauma, sharing her story when she was ready. Each time she spoke, the burden grew a little lighter, the chains of her past loosening bit by bit. Years later, Sarah stood in front of a classroom, her students watching her with wide, curious eyes. Miss Sarah, one of them asked, how do you always stay so strong? Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Because I learned that even in the darkest places, there's always a way out. You just have to keep fighting no matter what. As the class cheered, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. The shadows of her past would always be there, but they no longer controlled her. She had reclaimed her life, one step at a time. She had won her quiet war.